Today on the podcast, we continue our story of Disney artist Herb Ryman. Already we've explored his childhood, his work at MGM, his trip around the world, his personal art, and his early experiences at the Disney studio with Fantasia, Dumbo, and the 1941 trip with Walt and others to South America. In our most recent set of episodes, we've explored how World War II changed the Disney studio, with Walt taking on government contracts and refocusing production to meet the needs of war. As we last left off, Ryman learned that he would be the art director for a non-fiction animated film for adults called Victory Through Air Power, which explained the military theories of Alexander de Seversky. And as we pick up today, Ryman begins work on that project, a set of storyboards that he fears will move him from the world of art over into the field of graphic communication. And so, if you're ready, here we go. Ryman's initial assignment on Victory Through Air Power was to develop storyboards with Ken Anderson, which would illustrate Seversky's theories on the primacy of air power. By this point, the story team had converted Seversky's book into a treatment, with individual ideas organized into a series of short lectures. This treatment, along with the book itself, would guide Ryman and Anderson as they developed visuals to depict why long-range planes were essential to win the war. It was some basic information that we had to illustrate, Ryman explained. The purpose of it was for Walt to say to Alexander Seversky, "What do you think of this? This is what my two men have done." Neither Ryman nor Anderson thought much of the assignment. "I really dreaded the experience," Herbie said, "because I thought here my vast sensitive talent is being used to make little red arrows to indicate the attack patterns on a map." But they started on the assignment because they knew it was important to Walt, that he felt that these theories might make a difference in the war. Of course, Walt was intensely patriotic, Herbie added. Seversky would come in and he would encourage us, and Walt would give us threatening looks like, "You guys better do a good job because I'm counting on you." Then Walt and Seversky would go to another room where they refined ideas for the script. While work moved forward on Victory Through Air Power, Walt wanted to expand the studio's wartime exposure in yet another direction, this time with a film that would appeal to families. Over the summer of 1942, he corresponded with a British flight lieutenant named Roald Dahl, though many years later Dahl would find fame through novels such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach. In 1942, he was a new author who had completed a story about a group of fantasy characters called Gremlins, a cross between elves and winged pixies who, in England, were jokingly blamed for endless mechanical problems with new planes. If a plane lost altitude unexpectedly, a pilot might say, "The Gremlins did it." Engineers and maintenance workers blamed Gremlins for issues with engines, rudders, and wheels. It was a way of casting blame for these problems on someone other than newly trained servicemen. In Dahl's story, the Gremlins were not only real, they were upset that humans had torn down their woods to build factories to create tin birds, or as those humans called them, airplanes. These factories produced an endless line of propeller-driven Spitfire planes. As revenge, the Gremlins vowed mischief for those who flew and maintained those terrible creatures. Dahl's story focused on a British pilot who, through his kindness, persuaded Gremlins to help fight the Nazis. By mid-October, Disney acquired rights to Dahl's story, with proceeds being donated to the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, a charity for veterans and their families. Dahl himself agreed to help the studio develop a picture, as he was then working not as a pilot, but as an attaché to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. At this time, Disney believed that the film would largely be produced as a live-action feature, with only Gremlins themselves being animated. This would be a practical way to not only manage production cost, but to deliver the film quickly to theaters. Still, there would be unusual expenses. From the start, Disney realized that they were buying the concept of the Gremlins more than the story, which was little more than an extended anecdote. The story was just a few scenes in which one pilot befriended the Gremlins with no large conflict. In a studio memo, one artist explained that Doll's slender tail was, okay for reading, but it really doesn't hold together as a picture. Still, Walt believed that his artist could develop an engaging story long enough to support a feature. He also believed that they could create cute, easily lovable versions of these creatures, like smaller and greener versions of the Seven Dwarfs, figures easily admired by kids. Specifically, this film would counterbalance the adult-oriented production of Victory Through Air Power that the studio would soon engage on a soundstage. For his part, Ryman watched as the studio hired an artist who would, essentially, perform the duties that he himself had done at MGM. That is, Disney hired an art director to create indoor live-action sets of Seversky's office for a press briefing, something that Ryman could have done in his sleep. But as Ryman was far more valuable as a layout artist, the studio searched for an experienced artist attached to another studio. This person would not only work on Victory Through Air Power, but likely the Gremlins project and sections of live action that would be incorporated into later South American films. The person they found was Richard Irvine, better known as Dick, who at that time had worked as an associate art director on a handful of United Artists films. All of them produced by Walt Disney's close friend, Walter Wanger. I first met Walt back in 1942-43, Irvine explained, when I went to work on Victory Through Air Power. In terms of overall experience on live-action films, he had far less than Ryman. But with the current production, Irvine only needed to create a believable office for a military figure and businessman. It was an assignment far easier than the Victorian villages and French palace Ryman had once developed for MGM. Once a set of Seversky's office had been built and dressed on a soundstage, shooting began on October 13th. Seversky would stand in front of his desk while behind him on full display were a collection of his actual awards, including a gold sword he had received from Tsar Nicholas II for his participation as a pilot during World War I, and the International Harmon Trophy he'd received from President Roosevelt for outstanding leadership, patriotism, unselfish devotion to the security and aeronautical progress of the United States. The filming followed the script as it had been developed over the previous month. 4 reporters representing various interests, including a male reporter who believed the war could be won with traditional forces, and a female reporter who was concerned about how the war would affect young people, asked Seversky to explain why he believed America needed to focus on air power. Initially, shooting was scheduled for the day, but the crew soon found that, ironically, the sound of military aircraft being tested at the nearby Lockheed plant overpowered Seversky's discussion about the importance of air power. To solve this problem, Disney shifted shooting to the evening, but then the crew found a new set of problems. The first had to do with Seversky's leg. During World War I, Seversky had lost his leg, which had since been replaced by a prosthetic. By this point, he had used it for so long it was barely noticeable as he walked. Most of the crew were unaware of his disability. But without the rumble from Lockheed, a sound man started to notice an unusual background noise as Seversky moved across the set. We had a sound man here at the time named Sam Slyfield, who had an ear just like an owl. Disney artist T. He recalled he could hear everything. When a scene ended, Walt, who presently functioned as the live-action art director, called cut. If a take looked good, Walt indicated that the crew should set up for the next shot. But more than once, Slyfield, standing there with headphones over his ears, said, "No, Walt, there's a squeak there in the background." Most of the crew didn't hear it, but they'd learned to trust Slyfield. After a few takes, Walt asked, "Well, what the hell's the squeak, Sam?" Slyfield didn't know. It could be the flooring, a loose piece of furniture, how the walls were constructed. But then Seversky stepped forward. Taking in a breath, he said, "Well, I think it must be my leg." With that, the gaze of the crew fell from Seversky's face to his knee, now lifted, so his prosthetic leg swung freely on its artificial joint. A shadow of confusion briefly darkened Walt's face, but then it passed. "Oh, hell, my knee squeaks like that sometimes." Then to Slyfield he added, "Leave the squeak in, Sam. Let's go ahead." The next issue concerned Seversky's East European accent. Repeatedly, he was asked to reread lines for clarity. Some of the lines the crew noticed proved unintentionally funny, such as when Seversky explained that American planes would reach the beaches of the enemy or the bitches of Dunkirk. Seversky could never say beaches, Ryman recalled, and there was a little bit of humor that inadvertently crept into this thing. At this, the crew would quietly chuckle because it was as though Seversky were using derogatory slang to explain that the pilots were on a mission to find young women, perhaps sunbathing on the other side of the globe. Some crew members modeled sentences for Seversky while other lines were modified to fit his speech patterns. But as filming progressed, everyone saw that it would be a challenge to put together a nonfiction film on military theories for a general audience if Seversky had difficulty enunciating many of his lines. By the end of November, Walt had rough cuts of both Seversky's discussion with reporters and the animated introduction for the film, largely developed by Ward Kimball, that presented a short history of modern aircraft. Walt was so intent on quickly moving Victory into theaters that he asked key studio artists, along with his brother Roy and Seversky, to meet with him the Friday after Thanksgiving, even though many workers took the day off. The animated sequence, for the most part, worked well. It was filled with gags and interesting situations that conveyed how quickly aircraft had evolved over the previous 25 years. The rest of the film, though, had a different rhythm. Seversky, then animation, then Seversky again. As the first live-action reel was projected, everyone clearly saw Seversky's dialogue was a problem. Large sections had been edited both for time and for clarity. Rather sheepishly, Seversky said, "I see you cut my soliloquy." Walt considered this, then asked, "How do you think it worked?" Seversky suggested that they add back one point he felt central to his discussion, but overall he saw the section's weakness. "Right now it's too much like a newsreel," he admitted. Once discussion ended on the first reel, a projectionist loaded the next section, which included a few drawings that functioned as placeholders for the animation, and then Seversky appeared on screen. Walt again explained rather kindly why this section had been shortened. According to him, it had more to do with the audience's ability to take in long sections of information, rather than with Seversky's ability to present it. "And that's the trouble," Walt said. "It was too much to take in, too much to listen to." Beyond Seversky's delivery, Walt understood that there was another problem clearly visible on the screen. In terms of direction, these scenes lacked movement. They presented Seversky as a talking head, which in terms of the film's length was monotonous. Walt proposed that perhaps Seversky's sections might work better if his discussion was illustrated more with diagrams. Another problem concerned how an audience would read animation, as animation was often a genre of fantasy. Walt wanted to convey that animation here was deeply tied to reality. He suggested that the film first present either a photograph of an airplane or, even better, a newspaper clipping that featured an airplane, then transition into an animated presentation of that same plane so that audiences would see a deep connection between recent history and drawings up on the screen. Along these same lines, Seversky was confused as to why only the animation at the start of the film was complete. Walt then explained that a few drawings were there to time out each section so that editors could feel its rhythm. Animation for the body of the picture was still being worked out and developed to match the sections of live action recently finished. Though he didn't mention artists by name, the people developing these sections were Herb Ryman and Ken Anderson. In interviews, Ryman discussed his role on this film from various perspectives. He explained that at times he approached his assignment with seriousness and rigor. We read Seversky's book and it became our Bible. Other times he expressed an ongoing fondness for Seversky himself. We very much liked him, Ryman added. Among his motivations was also a deep respect for his boss. Walt was intensely patriotic, Ryman said. He saw this victory through air power as a contribution that he was able to make. But Ryman himself was growing frustrated with assignments that didn't challenge him. Though there were high points over the last 2 years, such as the trip to South and Central America and his friendship with Walt Disney, the overall quality of animation had steadily declined. Fantasia, an artistic high point, soon led to Dumbo, a cartoony feature, which led to serviceable graphics for Victory Through Air Power. Though the film's message contained cultural importance, the materials developed by Ryman and Anderson largely worked to illustrate Seversky's speaking points. At its worst, the film could be viewed as propaganda, its animation little more than a set of visual communications. Much as Ryman had suspected, arrows were used to indicate the movement of planes, ships, tanks, and bombs. The fullness of Ryman's frustration leaked out one weekend as he developed a set of storyboards with Ken Anderson. Their job was to illustrate new sections of Seversky's talk, finishing it over the weekend. "We don't want to draw a map," Ryman said. "We don't want to draw bombs. We don't want to do anything at all." In a story room, they did very little. Ryman eventually drew an aerial map of Japan, then one of the North Pole. "We were both very depressed," Ryman continued. As it was getting dark, they recognized that they had completed next to nothing. "You know," Anderson said, "we don't have anything for anybody." "And we've got absolutely nothing," Herbie admitted. Anderson, ignoring the assignment, sat next to a trash can where, page by page, he ripped out the contents of a book that he found offensive and threw them into the trash. It was a book of nudes intended as life-drawing models, images of women in various poses, but most of the animators treated them as intriguing pieces of pornography. "What the hell you doing?" Ryman asked. "Oh, it's a book I want to get rid of," Anderson said. "It's terrible." It was then that Herbie recognized what it was. It didn't take him more than a second to realize how those images related to their present assignment. Walt and Seversky had tasked them with creating a map that would outline flight paths to various beaches around the globe. Only when Seversky said that word, it didn't sound exactly like beaches. It sounded like a derogatory term for young women. Instead of making simple maps with planes muscling toward the beaches, they could tack up some of these nude photos, so it appeared that the planes were flying toward the word as Seversky pronounced it. "We were like children," Ryman explained, "like bad boys." They tacked up a photo of a woman with European features at the edge of Germany, a woman with Asian features at the edge of Japan. They created more maps, added more photos. "We finished 3 storyboards," Ryman said, but by then it was late. They considered cleaning it up, as clearly no one but them should see it, but they decided to come in early, long before anyone else arrived the next day, and fix it then. But that weekend, while Ryman and Anderson were working on storyboards, Walt and Seversky worked on the script morning and night. At one point, perhaps to get inspiration from the images, they visited the studio and walked into the room used by Ryman and Anderson. When Walt saw it, of course, Ryman explained, he was furious. But Seversky understood the joke, the gentle ribbing about his accent arranged into an elaborate set of storyboards, many drawings along with a handful of photos that covered multiple corkboards. This was a running gag that stretched roughly 20 feet. It was similar to the way that men teased each other in the military. Though Walt fumed, Seversky started to laugh. "Can I have this photographed?" the major asked, "as this is a treasure." When Ryman and Anderson arrived, everyone let them know that they were in trouble, that the boss had seen what they'd done. So Ken and I waited to be fired, Ryman confessed. We had put genitalia and bottoms and breast and things all in the storyboard. But Seversky's reaction, the way he found humor in it, somehow corrected the situation so that Walt, though still angry, let the issue pass. The highlight for the studio that fall was Saludos Amigos. Though it wouldn't be released in the States until early 1943, it presently played in South America to largely positive reviews. The film proved so popular that some theaters even discontinued the practice of double features to show Saludos Amigos continually throughout the day. Phil Reisman, president of RKO, who oversaw distribution to South America, was more than pleased with how the film performed, going so far to even suggest that receipts from Latin America might partially make up for closed European markets. "I have never seen more enthusiastic audiences than those which have greeted Saludos Amigos," he said. "Everywhere records were smashed, and the demand for more pictures of this type was amazing. From high officials down to the ordinary moviegoer, Saludos Amigos was acclaimed for its sincere effort to portray the art and music of the countries represented in the picture." Encouraged by these reports, Disney arranged a 2-week trip to Mexico to work on a second Good Neighbor film. This time, Walt would lead a small group of artists to Mexico City in the hopes of developing material for a sequel partially focused on countries and regions not in Saludos Amigos. The trip was planned for early December so that artists would be able to observe the Guadalupe Festival and other Catholic celebrations of Christmas, with the goal of creating a section to celebrate the winter holidays. The travel list included a few artists from the original trip, most notably Norm Ferguson, Jack Cutting, Chuck Wolcott, and Mary Blair. Walt also invited new artists to join this excursion, including Eric Larson, Freddie Moore, and Ken Anderson. But Ryman was not on the list, almost surely because his work schedule was full. He was the art director on Victory Through Air Power, a film that still needed significant work. He also worked as a layout artist on some of the propaganda shorts that explained the dangers of Nazi ideology. But throughout the studio, nearly all work stopped during the week of Christmas. Even during the war, the holidays were a high time for the studio. Ryman repeatedly found that he was one of the few, if only, studio artists asked to join the Disney family festivities. If Herbie's mother was in town, she was invited as well. Though Ryman didn't speak of Christmas 1942 specifically, he recalled the winter holidays during this period in general terms. "We had Christmas Eve and we had New Year's Eve with the Disneys," he said. "I was always flattered that I was included in those things because they were just family and I was not a member of the family, but I was treated as such. Walt wasn't Walt Disney, the businessman. He would sing or he would relax or he would help make the punch. He was a very normal person with his family." Early in 1943, the studio revised its plans for Victory. Walt scrapped all of the live-action footage shot the previous fall as it was too slow, too dull. Seversky instead would speak directly to viewers, explaining why America needed to develop long-range planes. In these new sections, he would focus on two theories. The first concerned the need for larger planes. As planes housed on ships were too small to carry large payloads, land-based planes were necessary to carry bombs large enough to damage Axis factories and power plants, thereby bringing the war to an end. The second concerned the importance of flying beyond a country's outer defenses. As Japan and Germany had fortified their production centers with hundreds of miles of military support, long-range bombers were necessary to fly above these outposts, whether they be on the mainland or on islands, to reach the production center of each country. This, in a nutshell, was Seversky's argument. Allied forces should not battle their way into sensitive areas using ships and ground troops, but rather develop planes capable of delivering bombs there directly. To improve Seversky's delivery, Disney requested he work with an elocutionist. Problematic words and phrases, such as beaches, were entirely removed from the script. Disney also handed over many sections of the script previously voiced by Seversky to a professional actor, Art Baker, whose voice would add polish. The film in this new version would alternate between sections delivered by Seversky, whose image and voice conveyed authority, and Baker, whose voice was easier to follow. The studio also hired Hank Potter to direct new live-action scenes, as Potter had experience with musicals, including Second Chorus, Congo Maisie, and most recently, Hellzapoppin'. He knew how to position and move the camera so that a film communicated the strength of performance. The studio hoped that his camera movement might also convey the vitality of Seversky's presentation. All through these months, Walt remained committed to amplifying Seversky's message by adapting his argument into a film. "I've tried to avoid the controversies between the different military theorists," Walt told the New York Times, "but one thing is certain. Air power is going to be mighty important not only in the war, but in the world we're going to live in afterward. People need to know about it. A lot of them are still bound by traditional ways of thinking, and a movie like this can break through a lot of misconceptions." Beyond Victory, the studio worked on a range of war-related projects, so much so that in 1943, over 90% of studio production was focused on the war. Again, the studio produced a Donald Duck cartoon for the U.S. Treasury, encouraging Americans to pay their taxes. To fund the war effort, the federal government again increased the number of people required to pay federal income tax. In the previous year, 1942, 36 million households were required to file tax returns. In 1943, that number increased to 43 million. These Disney shorts were largely designed to encourage new taxpayers to complete their returns. Disney continued to make training films for the Army and the Navy, dozens and dozens of them. Topics included how to visually identify warships and how to fly planes whose guns were in a fixed front-facing position. To one reporter, Walt explained the importance of these films. A new recruit must know how to repair a tank in the quickest possible time, he said. To tear apart a gun and replace the most intricate part without the loss of an instant. No medium can train a recruit in all these things with the same degree of lasting knowledge as the motion picture. In terms of animation, many theatrical shorts drew upon military themes, particularly those starring Donald Duck. Donald was featured in Fall In, Fall Out, The Old Army Game, Home Defense, and Der Führer's Face, a musical comedy ridiculing Hitler. Beyond those with familiar characters, Disney produced a range of propaganda shorts, including Education for Death, a film laid out by Ryman which explained how German youth were raised to believe that Hitler would save Germany from the democratic evils of the West. But in the middle of 1943, the most significant animated project remained The Gremlins. Over the previous 6 months, this project had changed many times. It had been originally imagined as a live-action film with animated gremlins, then briefly as an animated feature with no live action, then just as quickly as a 20 to 30-minute animated featurette. The largest change, however, concerned how the story was approached. In the original Roald Dahl version, the story had a significant focus on the human pilot who befriended the mythical creatures. But in the hands of Disney, it became far more the story of the gremlins as they encountered humans. The script for the featurette version, developed in June, mostly followed Gus, the middle-aged leader of the gremlins. Upset that humans had taken over their woods to build plane factories, he organized classes to teach younglings how to attack the Spitfire planes with crowbars, blowtorches, and stones. Their attacks, more nuisance than threat, would be presented as comic mischief, similar to the Keystone Cops. As this squad of newly trained gremlins attacked their first British Spitfire, they watched as other planes, clearly the Germans, moved in to attack the Spitfire as well. Once the plane crashed, its pilot, a young Brit named Scotty, explained to the gremlins that the real enemy here was the Germans, who hoped to attack all of England, including those places where the gremlins lived. In the days that followed, gremlins observed the German planes dropping bombs on the woods and towns around them. Elaborate scenes backlit by explosions. Watching the destruction, they realized that there was a greater threat than the plane builders who had torn down their woods. After the Germans attacked again, the gremlins joined Scotty on his new plane to confront the Germans in the air, flying after Nazis who appeared surprised to see such fanciful creatures moving at them through the air. Though earlier gremlin attacks were played for comedy, these now would present the intensity of a battle, as the little creatures understood the destruction the German planes might bring to their homeland. Work on the story continued through the summer. Ryman was placed onto the development team specifically to create layout drawings while his friend Claude Coates painted backgrounds. The development of this project was fluid, with new changes incorporated each week. At one point, story artists again considered making a live-action picture with only the gremlins animated. One animator, Ham Lusk, proposed that it be shot in black and white. If it were to be a live-action picture, he offered, people wouldn't be shocked to see it in black and white. In this, the film would look like the black and white newsreels of the war that audiences regularly saw at theaters. It would give the Gremlins project a higher sense of realism. Story artists also considered, as a publicity stunt, creating a training film that would detail how British officers could avoid the type of damage often attributed to gremlins, with the gremlins, of course, appearing in the film. By fall, though, there was a growing sense that the studio had waited too long to make this, even if it was arranged as a 2 or 3 reel featurette. Disney's distributor suggested that the public has become tired of so many war films. Beyond this, such a film would still take many months, perhaps even a year, to produce. Studio executives worried that such a film would only be valuable during the war. No one would want to see an animated feature or featurette about gremlins attacking German planes if the Germans were already defeated. They also sensed that, unlike Snow White or Dumbo, such a film would be difficult or even impossible to re-release 7 or 10 years in the future, as interest in war-related topics would likely decline or even disappear. Around the studio, Ryman continued to grow weary with assignments that were less than artistic. The avalanche of war-related shorts and training films taken on by Disney gave the impression that the war might go on for years. Though Ryman loved the studio, he grew restless. He was drawing maps, laying out films that instructed new recruits how to identify ships, and working on projects whose sole objective was to critique Nazi ideology. His work, it seemed, was once again far from the beautiful world of art school. It seemed like the war was interminable, he said. Though Ryman supported America, he believed that the war was anything but a sure win for Allied troops. In newspapers, he saw the balance of power shift between the Allies and the enemy on a daily basis. It seemed as though Nazi General Rommel was winning in Africa, he said, and the Japanese were winning in the Pacific, or at least blocking every effort that was made. Ryman sensed that the war wasn't likely to end in 1943 or even 1945, and propaganda shorts and training films would likely stretch far into his future. Frustrated with opportunities at the studio, he looked for ways that he might connect with the world around him as an artist, as a person who had something meaningful to say about the world, other than to create visuals that supported an endless dialogue focused on the war. Though he couldn't see it yet, these impulses, these bristling desires, would lead to the next phase of his life. As always, I'll be back next week with a new episode. As it will be the first Sunday in May, the plan, at least right now, is to post up our monthly news and analysis episode, and once again, there's a lot to talk about. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.